Anxiety. My name is Courtney Van Chagan. I'm a clinical social worker, and I run the behavioral health department for a federally qualified health center in the community. Right now I have a toddler in the toddler program here. My older son is 7, he's in 2nd grade, so he went through the primary program and moved on to public school. So we're going to talk about ADD and ADHD and what it is and what it's not, which I think is kind of a more important part of the discussion for most of us. How it's diagnosed, what medications do and when to use them. I get a lot of questions about that in my clinical practice. When you really need to get somebody's opinion and what some of the potential consequences are when you leave it untreated. So some of the first few slides have more words on it, but I really tried to do fewer words on my slides this time. So to start with, ADD is slower to catch the inattentive type and diagnose it than we would for kids who are hyperactive, who are all over the place and very easy to identify. So a 2-minute neuroscience lesson, like the most basic neuroscience lesson you'll ever get in your life. This is your brain. So our brains develop from the bottom up and from the inside out. So the first pieces of our brain develop in the brainstem, cerebellum, temporal lobe. Everything at the base of our brain is responsible for instinctive behavior and emotional development. And the higher up you go, toward the frontal lobe, is where you get into impulse control and higher level decision-making processes. So this is really important because the characteristics that have to do with attention issues all happen in the frontal lobe, and it's the last part of our brain to develop. So if you think about when we start looking for these problems, we start looking for them, or we start talking about them in really young children, typically kindergartners, or when we start to see a lot of discussion about problems with attention. As they're getting into school and more is being asked of them. That part of their brain has just started developing. So this is an important piece of the way that we look at what's normal behavior and what's problem behavior. Your brain isn't finished developing until you're into your late teens and early 20s, and that's the last piece to finish developing. So the ability to make, that's why we see teenagers who make stupid decisions and we scratch our heads and go, what are they thinking? It's that same piece of the brain that controls decision making and being able to anticipate consequences and being able to think through and control before they make a decision. All of that has to do with executive functioning, which happens in this front part of the brain right here. So the first things that we see in brain development, and the piece that we all see if you have toddlers, is around that like visceral, throw myself on the floor and just throw a tantrum and I can't use my words and I'm just gonna kind of feel all over the place. That's lower down in brain development. So they're able to express feelings way before they can express with their words what the feeling is. And then they're able to act on the feeling way before they're able to slow down and kind of talk through what it is. And all of it kind of happens piece by piece. So why that matters is because what we see in kids who have had their brains mapped is that front part of the brain for a kid who has a diagnosis of ADD or ADHD is this front part of the brain is much less active, which is a little bit confusing if you stop and think about it, because we're talking about kids whose behavior is really overactive for a kid with hyperactive behavior. But the reason that they're hyperactive is because this front part of their brain isn't as active as we need it to be. So it's not giving them enough guidance around controlling their impulses and slowing down. Does that make sense? I'm not a neuroscientist, so I try to make it really, really, really basic. This is also important when we think about and when we talk about what medication does. It acts on that part of the brain. So it stimulates, if you've heard the term stimulant medication, it stimulates that front part of the brain to be more active. So a lot of times adults who have had undiagnosed or untreated ADD and ADHD will drink like a ton of caffeine. Caffeine is a stimulant. What they're doing a lot of times without realizing it is sort of self-medicating to sort of stimulate and wake up that part of the brain. And that's the way that a lot of these medications work, is to just stimulate that front part of the brain so they don't, they're typically relatively short acting, they don't last for days and days. It's the period of time the medication's in your system and then it wears off. was a lot of information. What's really important, I think, as parents and as educators to understand about ADD and ADHD is that it's not just a kid who's running all over the classroom. There's very specific criteria, and it has to be met in more than one setting. So all of these things that have to do with being inattentive, not paying attention to details, not sticking with an activity, not listening when you talk to them, they have to meet at least 6 of these consistently before we can start talking about a true diagnosis of a problem. Avoiding things they don't like, being reluctant to do things, losing things, being really disorganized, being forgetful. So this is for the inattentive type. In order to meet the diagnostic criteria, they need to have 6 or more of these. And the reason I put this up here is because we way overdiagnose ADD and ADHD in this country. And it's really important to understand what should go into a thorough diagnosis so that you can ask good questions if you start hearing it coming up. Same thing for the hyperactive type. 6 or more of these have to be met. So squirming around, fidgeting, having a hard time sitting still, that probably describes most of our kids at one point or another. It does not mean your kid has ADHD. Getting out of their seat without asking, running or climbing when they shouldn't. This one is really, really important as far as I'm concerned. Unable to play or take part in leisure activities quietly. So a lot of times the markers that I look for when I get a referral, and I get a ton of referrals at the beginning of the school year. The kids have been home all summer, they haven't had as much structure, they've been hanging out, they haven't been following a routine, and all of a sudden they go back to school, and now there are rules, and there are routines. And one of the first questions that I ask is, can they play? Can they do an activity that they always like to do, and can they get through it from start to finish? If your child can sit and watch a 2.5-hour movie without a peep, that's a hard sell for me that they also have problems with attention and hyperactive. Now they may have other issues that we need to work on, but that one is really important, and particularly for the littler ones who maybe don't engage in all of those structured, homework and all of that. If they can't play with a friend and stick with an imaginative theme, that would be something that we would pay attention to. Acting like they're driven by a motor, talking a lot, blurting out. So all of those are kind of impulse control things, having trouble taking turns, interrupting. This is the hyperactive type. So typically this is diagnosed before they turn 12, and most typically much younger than that. And those symptoms have to be present in 2 or more settings. So a kid who's doing really, really well at home and having a hard time at school, and doing really well at soccer and really well at church, and just at school having a hard time, doesn't fit the criteria to be diagnosed with ADHD. And oftentimes, there are a whole lot of other things that are going on, either in the classroom or with peers, or there's something else happening at school that we need to take a look at, but really shouldn't necessarily be labeled ADHD. And it's an easy thing for us to talk about, in the classroom, and then the school will say, maybe you're going to go have your child evaluated, and we're kind of off to the races. So these are the kinds of things that we should be looking at. Not just how are they doing at school, but are you having the same problems at home? Are they able to sit still at church? Are they able to get through soccer practice without somebody having to be right there next to them, walking them through? If we start seeing the same constellation of behaviors or some version of it all over the place, okay, then we're getting closer to being able to talk about the diagnostic criteria. So how do we diagnose it? Screening tools is one piece of it. I brought one that we use really commonly in primary care, and I'm happy to share it if you guys take a look at it. I didn't make copies for you because I don't want you to go home and diagnose your children, which is what we will all do. It's like Google but on paper. So this is called the Vanderbilt Assessment Scale, and it's a 2-part scale. You can see it's really, really long. This is what we use in my practice. So there's a parent portion and there's a teacher portion. So when I get a referral for a child that we want to know more about, I send at least one copy of this to school, and then the parent takes home a copy of it. So the parent would fill out all of these questions, and it basically asks a lot of questions around the criteria we talked about. And the teacher gets one too, from their perspective about all of this behavior. And then they bring it back and we score it. So this is targeting at least 2 different settings. So this would get us closer. If a parent says to me, this is really a problem at Bible study, then we might send one to the Bible study teacher, or the soccer coach is really concerned, we might send one. So it doesn't matter, but we want more than one piece of feedback from another adult in the child's life. The screening tools are one piece of it. Teacher report is one piece of it, because a lot of times that's the first place that we get the behavior identified. Parents a lot of times will have questions about it. So particularly if you constantly find yourself saying, sit down, stop doing this, and it's, people start to kind of notice, or you're looking on the playground saying, my kid's not playing like other kids are, or that behavior seems odd in the classroom, or so all of those are pieces that go into initiating an evaluation. But then the last piece is also really, really important. So a good clinical assessment. So how do we look? What do we do besides talk to all of these other people? We talk with the child. We have the child come in and play. We sit down and see if they can complete some activities with us. Can they sit still on the couch? We use a very informal assessment tool in my office called the tornado effect. So if my office looks like a tornado came through it when the child leaves, then I might wonder about whether or not there's an impulse control issues going on. Because most kids understand kind of the routine around going to an office, right? So the couple of times when I've had a kid that's come in and taken everything off the shelves and then tried to climb the furniture and then, all that kind of stuff. And I walk out and I'm like, oh my gosh, and everything is all over the place. The lack of recognition around kind of what's expected in a certain setting sometimes can be a good indicator. So we look at their behavior, we also look at how they play, we look at how they interact with us. All of that goes together to make a good diagnosis. So then what do? Most of the time we get kind of to the medication piece really quickly. And most parents are pretty reluctant to do that. So there's a lot of times this sort of tension between what what doctors will say or what the school system will say and what parents want to hear, which is not, let me give my kid a pill a couple times a day and make them behave. There are lots of parenting strategies and behavioral interventions that are really, really effective for working with kids with ADHD and ADD. And that's important to know. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're heading down this road, it's okay to advocate for, I'd like to try some of these other strategies. If you have a school-age child, there are a lot of interventions that we can put in place in school, and some of that takes a really cooperative school team to work through that with you. But we don't have to jump right to, we're going to medicate your child. And there are some situations where that is probably a good answer, but it's important to be aware that there's a lot more to it. So school-based accommodations are the second piece of that. In the public school system, there's, for any of you that don't have children that are there yet, there's something called a 504 plan, and there's something called an IEP, an individual education plan. So the school has formal processes for asking for accommodations. They also have an informal process where you can go in and say, hey, let's try a few things, and the school-based team and come up with some ideas. And it might be really simple things to start with, like, can you move my kid from the back of the classroom to the front of the classroom? Can you sit closer to the desk? For some kids, just feeling like, the reach of authority is enough to curb some of that behavior. I have a student that I'm working with now who the school has given him one of those like yoga balls to sit on. They replaced his chair with a yoga ball. And this is outside of any sort of special education intervention or anything like that. The teacher just said, why don't we try this? It gives him a chance to kind of move around a little bit while he's working. That seemed to have been really helpful. So there are a lot of things that can be done in school before we get to the point of formal interventions. But then there are a lot of things that are available in the public school system, like having a teacher's assistant or somebody in the classroom for a period of time, having the student work in small groups, which for most kids is really helpful. Changing the environment where they're working, so if there's a lot of distraction or a lot of ambient noise, or a classroom with 16 boys that gets really rowdy, then maybe we need to go work in the library. There's all kinds of stuff that can be written into an education plan that can address a lot of these behaviors. And then medication, which is not a bad option for a lot of kids, and we can talk about why. So behavior therapy, which is the part that I do, should do a couple of things. It should focus on the behaviors that you're trying to increase and encourage, the positive behaviors, rather than stopping the negative behavior. If we've made a good diagnosis, the child can't control the negative behavior. His brain isn't doing what it needs to do to help him to control that behavior. So we don't get very far when we focus on stop doing X, Y, or Z. Or we might get there for, a really short period of time. They might do it once or twice. They might sit still once or twice or for 2 minutes. But focusing on the negative behavior doesn't get us very far. Their brains just haven't caught up yet. Focusing on the desired behaviors gets us much farther. The other piece is strategies that you can use at home. So a big piece of this has to do with how we talk to our kids, how we communicate with them, not just how we talk at them. And then also the third piece of this, and this is the piece that I think a lot of times we tend to overlook, is looking at self-esteem and the ways that they cope with being frustrated. So for a kid who hears all day long, sit down, keep your hands to yourself. Why didn't you do that? Stop talking. Where's your pencil? Did you lose your homework? Why didn't you clean up your room? Leave your brother alone. That's really frustrating. And most of the referrals that we get are for really young kids. So without meaning to, because we're correcting this behavior all the time, they're getting all of this, corrective behavior. And for most kids, they want to please. And so it can result in angry outbursts and kids who are really frustrated and kids who are, acting out at home because they're assuming they're going to be in trouble. And what ends up happening as a result of that is they start to develop self-esteem issues. They start to feel really badly about themselves, and they start to kind of say to themselves, I'm always getting in trouble, or my teacher doesn't like me, or I hate school, or, my mom likes my brother better, or whatever those things are, tend to play out. And it's really common in kids who have issues with attention. So focusing on what we want them to do and reinforcing that goes a long way toward addressing some of those issues. I'm talking really fast. Are you guys doing okay? Now we're going to be out here in like 10 minutes. Stay ready when you go. What's going on today? We talked about the school interventions. So they should include several different things. Accommodations that can be made in the classroom. If your child is getting ready to go out to public school, although we hope they're staying here for elementary school, but if they're not, all of the Fairfax County Public Schools have access to a psychologist who can and should be doing formal testing on a student before a diagnosis is made. Now they may tell you to go out and get another, evaluation, but every school has access to a clinical psychologist, and they should be doing testing, and it's a really thorough, lengthy testing process. And then what comes out of that is a set of recommendations. And there are two different kind of routes that can take. And I'm here at 504 plan, but that's a formal set of interventions that the school can put in place for a student who's not achieving their academic goals. So the piece about school that's important is that if it's just a behavior issue, but they're still doing well academically, you're not going to get a lot of services out of the school. So the school has to focus on whether or not the child is achieving academically. And as long as they're doing okay academically, and that doesn't mean excelling and headed to Harvard. It means meeting the basic requirements. The school is not going to do all of this. It's when it starts to impact their learning. Now, typically with ADD and ADHD, it's impacting their learning, so you get both. But for just behavior stuff where the kid is doing okay anyway, you're not necessarily going to get as much formal intervention from the school. So medication, which is always what everybody's concerned about, what everybody has a lot of questions about, there's a lot of stigma around it. It can be prescribed by your pediatrician. It can be prescribed by a pediatric psychologist, or psychiatrist, It can be prescribed by a neurologist. I've had several kids who've come to us prescribed by a neurologist. Most of them are what are called stimulant medications. So if you've heard of Ritalin, that was the most common one a while back. Concerta and Adderall are the two that are most common now. The generic is amphetamine salts. Typically they're given to kids before they leave for school. And then depending on how fast kids metabolize them, they may get a booster dose in the middle of the day. But it's typically the kind of thing that you work into your morning routine. And then off they go to school. The thing that's nice about these medications is that it's kind of like taking an Advil. You take it when you need it, you don't take it when you don't need it. So if you can manage your child's behavior at home and it's not distressing to you, give it to them on the weekend. not going to summer school, give it to them over the summer. Holidays, whatever. So it's very flexible that way, and a lot of times that's really reassuring for parents who hear this sort of, we're putting your child on medication. Yes, and also you get to have a lot of say in when. If there's a lot of issues going on in the classroom, then we need to give it to them when we go to school. It's a problem at church, give it to them on Sundays. Skip the times when you can manage the behavior or when they need a break from it. The most common complaints we hear about it have to do with appetite and sleep. Kids will often complain about headaches, and the headache piece tends to go away pretty quickly. But what we look for and watch very closely are a significant drop in their appetite and having a hard time sleeping. Now, kids that are really hyper, a lot of times will forget to eat, and so that's something that we pay attention to. If you have kids who are going to forget to eat anyway, and then we're going to give them a medication that's going to take away their appetite, and we're going to pay attention for kids who are really underweight. This is something that pediatricians watch really closely. The same thing with sleep. If you have a kid that takes you 2 hours to get them down, this may throw a wrench in the works in the evening for you. There's a lot of tweaking that can be done with the dosing, so sometimes it's a matter of giving the medication earlier or a smaller dose or something like that. So they're not disqualifiers by any means. The other thing to be aware of and to just ask questions about if you end up going down that road is that pediatricians and pediatric psychiatrists should be doing a cardiac assessment before we put kids on stimulant medication. So they'll typically just do an oral history, and then if there are markers for heart issues in your family, then they may have them be cleared by somebody before they prescribe a medication. If nobody talks to you about it, it's a good question to ask. I work in an integrated setting with a pediatric practice, and so it's standard practice in our practice, but not for everybody. So it's just a good question to ask. Your pediatrician may say, oh yeah, we know there's something wrong, and that's why I didn't ask you, but it's wise to be mindful of. So when would you decide to do therapy versus medication? Typically, this is kind of the rubric that we use. And what I say to parents is, if your kid is starting to tell you that they don't want to go to school, or that they hate school, or that their teacher hates them, or nobody cares about me, when you start to hear stuff around self-esteem, that's probably a good indicator that you want to do something, you want to do it quickly. If they're not performing academically, if their grades are really suffering, that might be something to take into account depending on how important academic achievement is in your family. And have they failed at other things? So have you tried some parenting strategies? Have you tried having some individual therapy to work on the anger issues? Have you tried partnering with the school and you're still not getting there? If you failed at several of those things, I guess a better way of saying that is if those haven't gotten you to where you want to be, then it's probably time to be thinking about medication. The thing that's really nice about medication is that it makes a difference almost overnight. So you can tell really quickly. I don't know what's going on. You can tell really quickly if it's working or not, almost immediately. Once you work through the side effects piece, you're kind of at where you're going to be. And like I said, the dose you can tinker with or not. But it's, again, kind of like taking an Advil that will make your headache go away right away. Once you start to stimulate that part of the brain, the behavior should improve. And there will still be a lot of other things that will need to get worked on, but some of the really obvious stuff, if there are particular points during the day where, one of the things we hear a lot from teachers is they sat in their chair. I didn't have to tell them 6 or 7 times to sit down in their chair, or they weren't constantly poking their neighbor with a pencil or whatever. Like really obvious behaviors that happen constantly, teachers will say almost immediately, like, but wow, you sat still today. So you can tell pretty quickly if it's helpful. So there's a lot of other things that it could be, and this is why we thought that this was an important conversation to have, because before we assume that it's ADHD, there's some other things we want to ask questions about. We don't want to medicate a problem that's not there. Adjustment disorders are probably the biggest. So did anything else happen recently in your child's life that would make it hard for them to cope or to function? If the behavior is relatively new, it could very well be a reaction to, and that could be a lot of things. It could be, did you just have a new baby? Did you just move to a new house? Did grandma just come to live with you? Did grandma just stop living with you? Did somebody die? Did they get a dog? It could be a lot of things. oftentimes they will get distracted because they're thinking about whatever the other thing is. That's not got anything to do with anything going on in their brain, well, anything going on with their brain development. It's got to do with there's something in their environment that's calling their attention. And that we would treat really differently. And so that's a big piece of it, is the behavior new. Have there been any major changes recently that would account for the behavior, or minor changes that would account for the behavior? And if so, we want to maybe go down that road first. Learning disabilities. So kids who have trouble reading, for example, aren't going to pay attention because they don't know what they're supposed to be doing anyway. Kids who have auditory processing issues or language processing issues or any of the kind of communication issues, I can hear you but I can't understand what you're saying, or kind of think of some other good examples that come to mind. Anything having to do with trouble with writing or with eye coordination, anything that would encourage them in a school setting to kind of tune out. If I don't understand what you're saying to me, if what you're saying to me doesn't make sense, I'm probably not going to pay attention to you. I'm probably not able as a little kid to tell you I don't understand what you're saying to me. I'm probably just going to look out the window or mess with my neighbor or, crawl around the floor or whatever it is. But a lot of times some of this stuff can be accounted for with a learning disability, and we put some alternative strategies in place at school to address the learning disabilities. The behavior will get better. That's why the testing piece is really important, because it may uncover other issues that just looked like a kid who had trouble sitting still, and really it was a kid who didn't know what was going on, so there was no reason to sit still. Anxiety is another one. So kids who are anxious, a lot of times will have trouble sitting still, or will be very distracted. The other piece of anxiety, and this sometimes is more common in adults, but you see it in children too, is to be kind of lost in your own head. So that can get mistaken for the inattentive type of ADD, for a kid who's really worried about something, or is typically an anxious kid that kind of seems to check out. It could very well be that it's not so much a problem with attention as it is with something that they're worrying about and they're not articulating it, and they look distracted or they're not paying attention, or they're expressing it by moving all over the place. And then normal immature development. So for the really little people, and even for some of the slightly bigger little people, if their brain hasn't quite gotten there yet, they may be just kind of on a slower track. So we'll ask about developmental milestones. How early were they to crawl, how early were they to walk and talk and all of those things. And if they kind of follow a slower trajectory on things, it could also be that it's just taking them a little while to catch up to their peers. And there's nothing wrong with that. So we all kind of walk around with these ideas of when it would be normal to walk or when they should be talking. And as parents, we get anxious when they're not doing it, and we compare and check in. But some kids just do those things a little bit later. And so before we start labeling it too much as a disorder, we want to kind of check in on, is this just the pace that my kid rolls at? And that might be fine. And so maybe they still need some help around some of those, controlling some of those behaviors in the classroom, but we may not want to stick a label on it of ADD or ADHD. And then this last one is kind of why we thought this would be a good topic: lack of understanding of expected norms. So how this matters for us is our kids are all in Montessori. Some of them are going to move on to traditional classrooms. The expectations are very different, and it can be really overwhelming for public school teachers who have a Montessori kid in a classroom, and it can be really overwhelming for kids who are transitioning from Montessori into a traditional classroom setting. And it's something to pay attention to, because if they're not clear about what's expected of them, or they've spent 5 years here in a Montessori setting, and they're able to kind of move around and choose what they want to do and when they want to do it, and they have a lot of independence in their classroom, that's not the way the traditional settings work. There's a very set schedule. There are set periods of time for each thing that kids work on, and they all do it together, and they all do the same thing, way more so than is true in Montessori. That can be a really big adjustment. And so for a teacher, that can look like a kid who's not able to follow directions, or a kid who's not able to listen, or a kid who's defiant, or any number of things. And it might very well be they have no idea what the new rules are. And it could be solved with something as simple as a conversation with the new teacher to say, what do you know about Montessori? Because my student has spent the last X number of years in Montessori. And there are an awful lot of public school teachers who have very little experience or understanding about what the model is. just be a simple, can I tell you how they've been learning for the past few years? This is what they're used to. We know that they have to adjust to the new way of doing things, but in the meantime, you might see them wandering around the room when they're not supposed to be, or telling you that they would rather be reading right now when it's time for math, or because that's what they're accustomed to. It's not an indication that they have trouble following directions or anything else. It's just an indication that they're learning a new way of navigating the classroom. And a lot of that can be offset with, some good preparation and kind of teaching kids ahead of time, this is how it's going to be and this is what it's going to be like. But good communication with those teachers is also really, really important. So this kind of ties back into some of the things we already talked about. When should you be asking for help? The big one for me is self-esteem. When you start seeing it impact your child's self-esteem, that's a good time to say you want to talk to somebody about ways to do things differently. For academic performance, particularly as they get older, matters. More in a setting and society that's really driven by that. So if they're not being successful academically, and we know that they can be, it's a good time to start asking for some of those things. If they start refusing to go to school, their mood seems really down, they're not interested in school, where they had liked it before. The conversation around my teacher doesn't like me, or the kids don't like me, or that's typically how kids experience it. The other kids don't want to play with me, or my teacher's always yelling at me, or those kinds of things where the behavior is starting to impact. The impact on peer relationships. So with the younger kids, where there's less academic markers, a lot of times it will be the kids just don't want to play with a kid who can't control their body, or a kid who, won't stick to the, we're playing dinosaurs, but now all of a sudden you're, playing rocket ship. If they can't, carry a theme of play through, or they're disrupting it, or they become, they're doing something out of step with what the group is wanting to do, kids will sort of self-correct and say, well, we're just not going to play with you. And some of that is really normal, but if it happens consistently that the child's behavior is getting in the way of them being able to have friends or make friends or play, that would be something to pay attention to. And then the last one I think is important. How stressful is it for you at home? So they might be doing reasonably well everywhere else, but you are just tired of telling them 600 times, pick up your socks. And why don't you just pick up the socks? And I just told you to pick up the socks. That might be a good point to then you would start with some parenting strategies and just some simple things at home. You don't need to jump into the deep end of the pool, but if it's something that you find yourself constantly like, at the end of the day, like, why is it so hard to get through a whole, day, or dreading like the days when school is closed because you're going to have an entire day of like clean up your room, don't hit your brother, why can't you listen to me? That wouldn't be a bad point to say I need to maybe check in and get some new ways to communicate. And we all do that, so that's not a judgment anybody can do it too. Please, when is school going to open? So what can you do? You can get the little mini parenting strategy session. So there's a couple of things that I always start off with any family that we're kind of ruling out ADHD with. Direct eye contact when you talk to your child. This is probably the hardest one, and every time I say it, parents say, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then I say, okay, so how do you typically give directions? Well, typically, you're folding laundry, or you're standing in the kitchen, or not going to be a picture of like a 1950s housewife, but you're somewhere in the house doing something, not with your kid, and you're calling down the hall, pick up your shoes and bring me your lunchbox from down the hall, or from the basement. I heard, stop hitting your brother, and we all do it. I do it all the time. It doesn't work with kids who have trouble with attention. You have to physically be looking at them. And standing in the kitchen and then saying, come here, I need to talk to you, doesn't work either, because there are a few things that are going to distract and strengthening that, listening part of their brain. Limiting environmental distractions. So if you have school-age kids who have to do homework, turn the TV off, turn the screens off, turn the music off, adjust the lighting, send the younger sibling out somewhere. The things that you can do to kind of control the environment will help and will reduce the amount of things they can be distracted by. And scheduling is important. So kids who have trouble with attention and kids who are hyperactive also can get really overstimulated. It's helpful for them to know what's coming, and sometimes it's helpful to have less packed into a day. routines is helpful for them because they know what to expect. And as you go through the day, you can kind of prep them for, we always eat dinner at the same time, or next we're gonna do our teeth, or, if they know what's coming, it helps them to be able to kind of move along with you and get to that same point in their day at the same time as you. So, it is a disorder, it's a psychiatric disorder, it has to do with brain development, and this is another piece that I think we overlook sometimes. Most kids will outgrow it as their brain continues to mature and develop. So even if it's something that we diagnose and we treat for a period of time when they're young, most of them, by the time they get into their adolescence, or certainly into young adulthood, their brains have caught up with them, and they will outgrow it. I had a teenager in my office 2 weeks ago who said, oh yeah, I think I outgrew that a couple years ago. And darn, wasn't right. He didn't need the medication anymore, he was doing really well in school. And on his own, he said, I think I just grew up. Fair enough, you did, your brain caught up with you. That's true. There are lots of different ways to treat it. The other pieces to it have to do with self-esteem and mood. And so that's a really good indicator that we need to do something about it if you haven't already. And then this last piece I think is important as parents and as educators. We need to ask a lot of questions, and we need to really advocate for a thorough evaluation. Just because the kid, like I said, is having a hard time sitting still in school does not mean that they have ADHD, and we need to be really thoughtful about labeling it that way, or saying, well, we just can put them on medication and that will help. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But we need to be thorough about what we're looking at and ask a lot of really good questions. And is there something else that's going on that maybe, we need to support and work out with your child? We don't need to go that route. So I think that's really important. This will be available somewhere electronically, right? Mm-hmm. So if you have older children who have already been diagnosed, if you're just wondering, but I did put the assessments up there, the third one down. Please don't diagnose your children, but if you're curious, go and look at it. Healthychildren.org is a wonderful website for all kinds of things. So that one I just keep bookmarked for everything, but there's some really good information about ADHD on there as well. So through the miracles of technology, that will be available to you somewhere in the interweb. So the next couple of things I have up here that we're going to talk about. Tackling taboo topics means how do we talk to kids, young kids, about things like sex and saying no in our bodies, and drugs and religion and whatever other kinds of hard to talk about things come up with as parents. If anything popped into your head right now and you thought, oh my gosh, yeah, I'm dreading when my kid asks me about fill in the blank, I would love to know what that is, because the two that always come to mind for me are around sex and everything that has to do with babies and bodies and all of that, and around drugs, which is often for kind of an older set of kids. But if there are topics that you know are really loaded and are hard to talk about in your family, I would love to hear what they are and see how I could kind of work that in, because it's not done yet.
I have one.
Okay.
Death.
Oh, thank you. Death and divorce were also on my list. Thank you. So that was on our list so far. Death, divorce, sex, and we'll put a question mark by drugs. I don't know that any of our 5-year-olds are at this. And then screen time, which I know my husband is really interested in, because we line up on different sides of the impact of screen time. And then just in general, working through the maze of behavioral health. So, I did talk really fast. That's for you guys, take a breath. Do you have any questions about ADD or ADHD or anything else? I don't know, maybe umbrella.
I do. So, my son, a lot of people here know who he is, we've had him in like different environments for tests and everything, and one of the things that they brought up was some of the things that I was saying was ADHD or like sensory processing, or like they don't say FPD because it's not a clinical thing, but to me it's FPD. But it was like the autism spectrum. So how, like, basically they want me to go have him diagnosed again for that, even though I did that before and it wasn't. So like, how do you guys handle that? Like, do you do the same thing? Or like, how do you distinguish between what's
Separating out like what was on the spectrum, and SP are the interventions that you want to try. We have a hard time with it too. There is a lot of overlap. To the extent, I think the intervention piece is the more important piece. So figuring out what are going to be the ways that you're going to work with your child. And there are specific, and I don't have any expertise in the sensory world of things, so I'm not the best person to ask about that part of things. But a lot of the interventions and a lot of the strategies that you would use for children on the spectrum are a little bit different than the kinds of things that you would use for a child who is able to read, you know, social cues well and just needs some help staying on track. So it might be that you try different approaches and see what's going to work, and that will get you a little bit closer to, oh, we found that, you know, this really wasn't very helpful. We tried this other thing and it was really helpful. So kids who are on the spectrum, modeling doesn't always work. Modeling concrete behavior works really well, but they don't read as well the connection between how somebody's feeling or what somebody's expectations are. That piece is a lot harder for them to navigate. If there's sensory issues as well, that can be really overwhelming, and that can be a place where there's that overlap of like, they just shut down, they don't pay attention, they check out. Okay, so then the interventions that you would probably want to start with would be around what can we either reduce in the environment, or are there specific inputs, for lack of a better way of saying, are there specific, you know, tactile things or sounds or things that are helpful, and try those and see if that improves their ability to pay attention. And that kind of gets you a little bit closer to, okay, then it's probably more in this direction. For a child who just has, for a child who has a hard time with attention issues and the executive functioning piece, they don't care whether the lights are on or off most of the time. They don't care, you know, if you take away a particular tactile issue or give them one, it becomes a toy. But for a child who has a hard time with sensory issues and it's more in that bucket, that will make a big difference, and you'll see an impact on her behavior. So if I was working with your student, I would start with, let's try out a few interventions and see how do those work. Well, those didn't work, okay, well then we know it doesn't work, let's move in the direction of what's the next thing that we can try, and it might be in a different.
Was there a chance it could be good?
Absolutely.
May I add to your
Yeah.
Sensory integration dysfunction is a little different than the processing disorder, and that you may want to consider having an evaluation with a pediatric OT who specializes in sensory integration, because I've seen a lot of kids be able to comply and be more successful in relationships and in, for instance, the classroom, when those sensory, either seeking or avoidant behaviors are addressed in that kind of a clinical setting, which is a really fun clinical setting. So for instance, if the child had vestibular seeking behaviors, like having difficulty knowing where his body was in space, or really needing to have that part of him stimulated a lot, or was avoidant of that.
There's stimulated.
Okay, yeah. So there are a lot of really fun swings and pieces of equipment, and kind of in a macro type of way of working with the body and the brain, and also on smaller scale things with the fine motor. But it sounds like more gross motor intervention could be something that you might want to explore getting help with before thinking about meds, or you know, and then the atypical parenting strategies. It just doesn't come. It's counterintuitive.
We've been down that, we've been down that road.
Yeah, so it can be really frustrating.
So that's a piece, yeah, where some of the interventions. Right, but so sometimes the interventions kind of get you closer to an answer. And if it's related to sensory issues, then, I mean, there are, you know, for kids who need less of it, there are weighted vests that they can wear like under their clothes, and you can wear to school, and that helps them to kind of keep it together and feel a little bit safer and more contained. And there's all kinds of stuff that some of it, you know, a good evaluation, and OT is a really good suggestion, occupational therapy, may get you closer to figuring out if that's going to be the right basket. But yeah, it can definitely be more than one piece. It can be that one piece is much easier to manage, and once you hit on it, you go, oh, okay, so that piece is under control. Now what's the next piece? But that's how, you know, all of us are, right? It's not cut and dry. It's frustrating as a parent because you're driving all over for appointments and the behaviors are really hard to manage. And I I would say please make sure that whoever you're working with is really supportive of you and not just talking at you about what you need to be doing and where you need to be going and all of that, because it's hard, right? Because things like timeout don't work, then what do you do when your child's just not listening? So, yeah, it can definitely be more than one.
Right, one more question.
Yeah.
Is it genetic? Is ADHD, is that been like proven genetic?
No, there's not a lot that's been proven yet in the behavioral kind of the more behavioral disorders. So no, does that mean that it's not more common in family trees, in some family trees than others? No, but that could be for a lot of reasons. It could also be that a parent that has a hard time paying attention has a more disorganized style of parenting. And so if you have that from day one, does your child have a harder time making sense and organizing? Yeah, maybe. That's a big piece of it, I think, with a lot of things, is some of the brain mapping slide that was up here. That's kind of where the science is at, is really looking at, like, how does your brain work when it's having a hard time paying attention, and how, what can we do to help it to function more efficiently. But a big piece of that too is really looking at what are we expecting of kids as their brains develop. And so a lot of what we have been saying over the years around diagnosing ADHD really early and getting kids on a like a treatment plan kind of runs counterintuitive to the fact that our brains just aren't done developing yet. And so we really need to think about how much we label as a disorder and how much of it is just kids have a hard time paying attention and sitting still when they're young because they weren't meant to do that. And the way that we teach our children is really different than it was 50 years ago, and the amount of playtime that they have is really different than it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So as expectations in the environment have changed, our brains haven't. They still need that time to play. There's also some interesting research that suggests that the more physically active our children are, the more quickly their brains develop. The centers of the brain develop more quickly and they're stimulated by physical activity. But we're a much less physically active society, and we expect them to sit still, which runs counter to what facilitates brain development. So actually, if we want them to pay attention and be able to attend, they need to move around. And they need to move around a lot, and they need to do it consistently. But we put them in situations where they have to sit still a lot and listen a lot. And so the brain has a lot to do with it, but we're not at that point where we would say it's genetic. There's no test that can kind of look for it. Environment plays a big role in it too. Yeah.
Is there any research that shows that behavioral modification or therapy alone modifies the structures of the brain and can sort of reverse or turn the red part of the brain map green, so to speak?
There is definitely research that shows that behavior modification can change the red part green. I don't know of any research that says it modifies the structures of the brain, but there's definitely.
Whatever would turn it green. So.
Yeah, biofeedback is a good example of that, where we give a kid an activity to do and have them do the activity, like a concentration activity, and then watch how effective their brain is at attending to it and paying attention to it. It's a sciencey activity, but it speaks to the fact that without the addition of medication or anything else, we can teach kids to concentrate and focus more effectively. And there are lots of different ways to do it. There's a lot of times people like this. This is my husband. There are video games that you can do, kind of get kids to focus on a particular activity, and move this object over here, or move these shapes around, just using executive functioning skills, using their concentration skills. That does over time turn that spot green. So that's more about the cognitive piece of it. But we can teach kids behavior modification can help kids to improve their ability to control themselves and think through absolutely. It's got a lot to do with how are they feeling about themselves while you're doing it. Because that takes a lot of time to change behavior. And if the issues are so significant that they don't have friends, or they're really stressed out at home, or they feel really badly about themselves, then you may want to do two things at the same time. I have a few cards. If you think of questions and you just didn't want to ask in front of everybody, I'm happy to, of course,